Welcome to the Full Circle Brussels channel. Today's talk is by Laura Mucha on love.
How would I describe love? I don't know, how would you describe love? This is quite a big question. I really don't know. How would it...
Something that everybody else has. As a stray tear goes down my cheek. Something that brings you a lot of pleasure, but that really hurts, and as you can control it, it's very difficult.
It's pretty vast. Love is really vast.
Love is a word that's just used all the time. It's the context in which it's said. Like it's when, oh, you ain't showing me no love, as opposed to, you ain't showing me no love. That's the difference.
A combination of like emotion and passion and care for another person.
When you feel love, it makes you feel like you're not nothing.
A longing to be with a person and wanting to combine your life with theirs.
Acceptance, tolerance, respect, having a spark of life that sometimes I think it's accepting the good and the bad and considering how much worse off it could be.
Love is, you worry about where they are when they're not around. You always want them around.
Magical. Oh, that's nice. Hard work.
My experience is love is, of course, that funny feeling that you feel in your stomach and all that, but also being able to ride the rough times out.
You should feel that you can develop into the person you need to be, but also that person knows that you're core who you are.
What I think it is a deep admiration for someone or something. That's specifically in contrast to, I think, how most people view love, which is a feeling that tries to make you feel whole when you don't otherwise.
Probably, I'm gonna sound too romantic, but it's the most important thing in life.
Love is a chemical imbalance in the brain, but it's a good one.
So, now I'm going to go to explore the big questions that you might have wondered about at some point in your life, or maybe not. And the first one is, does love at first sight exist? Now, when I express my views on this, I think I come across as like really cynical, because I always meet people who believe they fell in love at first sight and have been together for a very long period of time. But the main issue I have is for every person I interviewed who fell in love at first sight and got it right, I interviewed just as many, if not more, that fell in love at first sight and got it wrong. And the consequences were disastrous. So Sophie, who's a model I sat next to on a plane, fell in love at first sight as someone who turned out to be a stalker and recorded all her phone calls. And someone else that I met in the south of France fell in love with someone who at first sight who was a pathological liar. And she said, I would have given him, everything I had. And thank God he didn't take it, because that was how convinced I was. And so I almost feel like it's a policy decision. I don't think it's kind of safe almost. I always think about when I'm writing nonfiction, at least, of like my responsibility. And I didn't want people, particularly young people, to read it and go, it does exist. Therefore, this person that I've known for like 30 seconds could be the person I'm going to be with forever. And I'm going to build up all the commitments and do everything that kind of keeps me here, only to realize they're a pathological liar or they're a stalker or whatever. And also like the darker sides of love. Like people who are abusive tend to be incredibly charming at the outset. And we now know things about the brain, which is that it's basically like genuinely comparable to taking drugs, which I'll come on to. And so I feel like it's a bit unsafe, really, to say that it does exist. In my kind of quest to explore whether I was just a really big old cynic, I spoke to other people about it. Oh, that's Danny in South France. And then also Ricardo in Colombia, who said that he knew in the window that he would marry her, but she thought he was an idiot. And for 12 years, they didn't speak. And then, like, what exactly is love at first sight? Like, if one person is convinced the other one thinks it's an idiot, is that love at first sight? I've come on to the person I spoke to. I spoke to a philosopher about the requirement of time. But I think it speaks to exactly what love is. And as a lawyer, as an ex-lawyer, I'm really into definitions. Like in any contract, you'll have definitions at the start. Whereas in love research, people just bandy the word love around without really clarifying what they're talking about at all, which is unhelpful. And in general conversation, we'll say, oh, I love my handbag, or, oh, I love this meal. And we'll also say, I love this person. And what does it actually mean? So I thought I would just read some definitions from the book so that we're kind of on the same page. And then it will clarify what I mean about this whole love at first sight thing. So lust, also known as passion, sexual desire, or the sex drive, is a heady, intoxicating, obsessive, and powerful drive aimed at getting us to reproduce. It can be directed at different people, lasting only moments, but it can also be directed at mostly one person, lasting months or years. That said, it's not necessarily consistent. It can come and go in waves, influenced by hormones and behavior, and the research on that is really interesting. Lust can be negative, using others to satisfy our own ends, but it can also be reciprocal, fulfilling and meaningful, without being love. Lust is usually a feature of romantic love, which can make it difficult to tell them apart. Romantic love, being in love, falling in love, passionate or erotic love, is made up of intimacy, which requires time and vulnerability, and lust, but not necessarily commitment, which I'd argue is necessary for a successful long-term relationship. Like lust, it can involve a certain amount of idealization at the start, and the vast majority of the time it dwindles, but not always. Companionate love is a calm, stable love, often seen in mature, long-term romantic relationships. In companionate love, both the relationship and each other's complexities and contradictions are honest and realistic. Companionate love looks and feels much more like committed best friendship than a heady, passionate infatuation. Unlike romantic love, lust may not be there from the start. It might come and go, and it might be less intense or frequent. Instead, partners may develop a deeper but more relaxed attraction to each other. So, looking at those definitions, the sort of love that I think makes up, and I'm not alone, like this, I'm like joined by loads of relationship psychologists, although they come up with 1,000 different words for it. And, I've broken it down into 3 and some break it down to 5 and to whatever. But on the whole, most agree in this distinction between romantic and companionate love. And companionate love, most agree, and I firmly believe is what makes long-term relationships last. And that requires time and intimacy and realism. And that cannot be achieved when you're high on dopamine and when you haven't had the time required. So, lust and romantic love. There's some amazing research on this. And I say lust or romantic love because, as I mentioned earlier, lots of scientists aren't clear about what they're talking about. So they'll shove people in a brain scanner and go, are you in love? And you're like, what does that mean? Because people mean different things. Some people say they are in love when they mean they're in lust. Anyway, what they found is very interesting. But I'll begin with rats, which is why I've got a little rat on the screen. In the 1950s and 60s, some neuroscientists thought that there was a part in the brain that might be responsible for pleasure. So they got some little rats and they attached lots of wires to their brain, and they gave them the choice of a lever that gave them food or a lever that gave them stimulation in this part of the brain. And the rats opted for starvation because they loved getting that stimulation in that part of the brain. So just to be clear, the rats were opting for death because they loved stimulating that part of the brain so much. One rat pressed the lever 7,500 times in 12 hours. This part of the brain is the brain's reward system, and it's this part of the brain that is engaged in early romantic love or lust. They also did some experiments with humans until they decided it was not ethical. And in those studies, people fell for the experimenter or likened the stimulation to orgasm. Sorry, I don't know why the text come up small. So Claire in Frankfurt, who I interviewed, said, don't give me cocaine, don't give me heroin, give me a married man. And I thought at the time this was a slightly controversial statement, but then when I looked at the science, it turns out she was actually articulating something quite true, which is when people were put into brain scanners and they had fallen in love in the last 3 months, the same parts of the brain or similar parts of the brain were activated as those who had taken opiates or cocaine. And Sarah Leibovitz, who's a specialist in addiction, says, there is no drug that can provide a high as reliably as that right person. Companionate love, on the other hand, isn't like that. It's more like a skill, I think, and it's about patience and acceptance and humility and tolerance. And it's just not as glamorous. It's about like doing the dishes and making slightly boring life decisions and the day-to-dayness of it. So you can see that it's like hard for them to compete. So when I talk about does love at first sight exist, I think it comes down to the definitions of love and also the policy decision of the dangers of saying yes, it does. So philosopher Simon Blackburn, I went to Cambridge to interview him, and he has a leading philosophical text on lust. And he and I talked about this idea, and he said, love requires a certain timescale and a certain history. And if the whirlwind doesn't lead to that timescale and history, it wasn't love. It was just a delusion or a fantasy of the moment. And you only find that out with hindsight. So that's why I don't think love at first sight exists. But I think probably it's lust at first sight with the potential to become love, but you will only know with time. Should you just know if it's right? The reason I asked that question is really just to give me an excuse to talk about my favorite thing, and it's what my next book is on, and it's the most amazing theory, but also very complicated. It's the most researched area in psychology and one of the major developments in human development, and it's called attachment theory. And the basic premise is we're not the same when it comes to intimacy and commitment. So going back to the last slide, to say should you just know if it's right, it relies on the premise that we are all the same, and now we know we're not. The theory is essentially, and this is a summary and it is incredibly, incredibly complicated, and don't Google it and don't buy books on it because a lot of them are wrong and a lot of it is wrong. There are 3 basic attachment patterns. There is a 4th, but I'm not going to go into it because it's very complex. Secure, avoidant, and anxious. They have different names depending on the researcher, but I'm just going to stick to these. The basic premise is that when we're born, we're useless. And if a tiger came along, we'd get eaten because we're born so young compared to the rest of the animal kingdom. So what we do in order to survive is we attach ourselves to someone, might be a biological parent, might not, who is theoretically responsible for our safety. And so in many cases, this is great. We attach ourselves, and the person or people that we attach ourselves to provide us with a sense of safety. They are consistent, they are sensitive, they comfort and soothe us, they help us regulate our emotions, and we internalize the idea that relationships are safe, that we are worthy of love, that we can control our environment. And that is true of 58% of the population. Not strictly true, because you can grow up not with that and become secure, but it's a bit murky. You might not have that for a number of reasons. 1, your parents might not be secure. 2, your parents might divorce. Or they might threaten to send you away, which is not great news for kids. 1 might die. They might have mental health problems. You might be growing up in an abusive situation. So where that happens, and one more, which kind of falls into the parent being insecure thing that I mentioned earlier. If someone has trauma or loss that they haven't processed, it can really influence the way that they parent. So the other 2 main types are avoidant and anxious. Avoidant as a child essentially manifests itself as a child figuring out that they can be physically close to a parent or caregiver if they don't make demands. So if they make demands, that parent or caregiver might reject them, might get annoyed with them or punish them. And so they learn that it's just easier and better to not ask, and then you get to at least be close to your parent. So what happens in this assessment called the strange situation, where the parent leaves the child in a strange room with a stranger and then comes back. If you watch the child in that situation, if they have an avoidant relationship, when the parent comes back, the child won't look at the parent, the child will distract itself with toys. And the theory is, according to the attachment psychologists behind this, that what you're doing there is distracting yourself, because if you were to look at your parent, you might get upset. So if you don't get upset, you don't have to soothe yourself. So you avoid the trigger that makes you upset in the first place. And this then becomes an entrenched pattern where you kind of idealize independence, don't connect with your emotions, don't like to feel vulnerable. And some psychotherapists argue that what you do is you project that vulnerability onto others because you don't want to see it in yourself. In adult relationships, they can be described as unforgiving and picky and arrogant. The idea being, if you're the only person you're prepared to rely on, you want to see yourself as really amazing. Anxious is the other type, and instead of distracting themselves, they are hyper aware of where the people they love are, because they're not really very able to soothe themselves. The way they soothe themselves is by getting others to soothe them. This means they can be perceived as needy and clingy. And it also means that if they don't get that felt security, that emotional closeness, then they can go into what's called protest behavior, which is angry, frustrated attempts at getting close. So just to kind of summarize on the stats front, that means that 42% of the population, based on a really robust review of studies across multiple countries, 42% are insecure, i.e. avoidant or anxious. And this is independent of gender, intelligence, or memory. And that means that no one is too clever to be insecure. It also means that the idea that men tend to be unavailable and women tend to be needy is not true. So should you just know if it's right? No, it's based on a false premise. If you're avoidant, you will probably never know it's just right, because your way of being in the world is to question and look for escape routes and to subconsciously distrust love. And if you're anxious, perhaps you'll just know that everything is right because you are much happier being in a relationship than being on your own. Is there such a thing as the one? You might think it's a bit of a ridiculous question, but 31% of men and 26% of women believed that each person in the universe, this is in a US study, has only one true love. And when they looked at 20 to 29-year-olds, 88% of single people thought that somewhere out there was a soulmate waiting for them. What I find extraordinary about this is what they think the soulmate would be doing, like just waiting, knitting, waiting to be like discovered. And also what happens if, like, mathematically and logistically speaking, that soulmate is, you know, across a different side of the world, doesn't speak the same language, is, you know, 80 years age difference. Like, it really does make no sense, and yet it is such a pervasive thought. So the reason I say no is, first of all, I don't think it makes any kind of logical or mathematical sense. But also I think it's quite unhelpful, like, again, as a policy decision. So what, people that are bereaved are doomed? Like, sorry, I'm so sorry your partner died. Now you're stuffed because that was the one, and there's only one, so have a great time. But also, it totally overlooks personal responsibility in relationships, and it places all of the emphasis onto the other. And as we discuss now by looking at the definitions of relationships, companionate love, which makes long-term relationships last, is about tolerance. That is not to do with finding the magical right other person. It's a skill, it's hard work, like commitment, forgiveness, compassion. Like, I think that it's very irritating and unhelpful and dangerous idea. And there's also a lot of research into the impact of unrealistic expectations. And if you have unrealistic expectations, which are often tied into the belief in the one, because if you believe there is a one, then you might believe that you're kind of like cosmically meant to be together, and therefore you might be able to mind read, which people do believe, but humans can't mind read. But if you believe you can mind read, then and other such unrealistic or impossible expectations, then the research suggests that you're more likely to break up. You're less likely to think that hard work will make the relationship better. You're less likely to see a therapist. You're more likely to think that the solution is simply to find another person. And this just totally misunderstands the nature of love. So what should you look for in a partner? Well, I think there's been some really interesting research on this. Here are some of the answers that have come up. You might be comforted to know that in a very large study called the International Mate Selection Project, because that's obviously what we're doing, we're looking for a mate, which was conducted across 6 continents with 37 countries and 10,047 people. So a massive piece of research. When people were asked what they thought was most important in a romantic partner, people of all backgrounds, ages, and genders said that kindness and understanding was the most important, which I love. They also, in some countries, thought virginity was important, but less so in some of Western societies. There's some interesting research on humour that basically men, I mean, it's quite small research, but entertaining, that men want, heterosexual men want women who will laugh at their jokes, and heterosexual women want men who will make jokes. But surely you want both. And also women found derogatory humour acceptable for like a fling or a one-night stand. But for like a long-term thing, they were looking for something a bit more kind of consistent and compassionate. So theoretically, men could use that as a way of like filtering women out. If they just want something quick, they can be derogatory and filter out. There's a lot of evolutionary psychologists like to argue that women are after money. Their kind of slightly tenuous arguments on this front are that because women have to grow humans, if they choose to, for 9 months, and if they are able to, and then in many cultures breastfeed for a very, very long period of time, whereas men can just off you go and then goodbye, that women look for men with lots of resources or money to help bring the children up. But in the Mate Selection Project study that I mentioned, where kindness came up as number 1, money was like number 9 or something for women, and it came lower than health and kindness and exciting personality. And so I don't think women are the money grabbers that evolutionary psychologists would like us to believe. There is some slightly depressing research on youth, which is that heterosexual and homosexual men tend to prefer partners as they age. Their preferences don't necessarily age with them. And so if you look at real data from online dating studies, so like not an experiment, like actual behavior, albeit restricted to online daters who aren't representative of everyone who dates, that basically like they'll message people, but they'll kind of almost moderate who they message. So if they turn 40, then they'll decide, okay, well, 35 is probably the youngest I can go. And then they reach 40, like they'll be 41, 42, 43, 44, and they'll keep messaging 35-year-olds. And then when they turn to 45, it's as if they think, oh, 35 is a bit young, I'll go to 40. And then they stay 40 until they're 45, 46, 47. So it kind of looks like this, okay, where rather than like an increase in line with theirs. Whereas if you look at what they're rating in terms of what they actually think is attractive, not messaging, but attractive, all the way up to 50, men's preferences in heterosexual online dating stay between 21 and 24 years of age in terms of looks, which is a little depressing. If you're a heterosexual female and you're not 21 to 24. But I like to think that is, just online dating. It's a bit more complicated when it comes to women, and when it comes to homosexual women, and it kind of, the evidence isn't consistent, it jumps about a bit. So some stuff that I've concluded about, I think, in terms of what you should look for is, like, given that love is a skill, I think if you want a long-term relationship, then someone who's prepared to put in the hard work, which isn't everyone, and to understand that commitment is more important than connection, and also explore what commitment means, because there are very different beliefs in commitment, and your belief in commitment will impact how committed you are. Don't be overly picky, because first of all, that might be avoidant attachment in action. So no one's good enough, therefore you don't have to make yourself vulnerable. But also the research is so robust on the fact that what we say we want isn't what we go for, whether it's online dating or speed dating. Like, it's a very consistent finding. As in, like, you fill in a form before you go into speed date and you go, I really like tall blondes. And then you go in and the only person you say yes to is someone short with dark hair. I mean, it's literally that kind of contradictory. If you have an insecure attachment pattern, there is a theory, according to some attachment therapists, it's like researchers, that you should go for someone secure because they will bring you to security. If we were to have someone who is avoidant with someone who is anxious, then you would have the avoidant needing their independence and the anxious needing to be close. You can imagine how that would create a kind of chase withdraw pattern. And finally, wait till the drugs were off before committing. Because, I mean, I don't think it's a good idea to make massive decisions if you take cocaine, you know, like, you just wouldn't do it. And also, there's some amazing research on how relationships change you, and they do over time. In the Seattle longitudinal study, couples were found to become more similar in happiness levels, vocabulary, and intelligence, and also openness to new experiences over time. So I think there's a question of who do you want to become? So the next question is, do you even want a partner? 49% of single people in a UK study, admittedly a very small UK study, said they didn't want one. But the 49% is, you know, there are relatively similar stats from the US and Japan. They enjoyed being able to choose how they spent their time, not being nagged, spending money as they liked, and a sense of achievement about coping on their own. Of those above 65, none were interested in finding a partner, which I think is fascinating. This is from the British Household Survey, which was a really good piece of research that looked at people across, like a nationally representative sample, so people across the country, and it followed them over time. And the researchers were like, look, yay, marriage does make you happier. Look at the graph, can you see? Beep. And then it goes back to normal. And so they were like, apart from the beep, they concluded that marriage doesn't make you happier. It kind of sort of puts you back to your base level, but maybe, said Stevie App, one of the researchers on the project, it doesn't make you happier, but it protects you from a decline in happiness that we see in people who are unmarried. But I think there's like a big disclaimer when we do any like analysis of married versus unmarried research, because as I'm sure you will all know from your personal lives, married and unmarried describe very big groups of people. Like, within marriage, you have absolutely miserable, abused, waiting to escape, staying together until the children grow up and then getting out of there as soon as they can, having multiple affairs, empty shell marriages, or truly, really, actually really happy, or early stages, high on dopamine, have no idea who the other partner is because they're still projecting. And then in unmarried, we have, you know, newly bereaved, on a roller coaster of emotions, need to process that, or single parents, or desperate to have children before they are unable to, or living with their best friends nearby, very happy, thank you very much, don't need a partner. There are just so many, it's oversimplistic to group and compare in that way, but the reason they do it is because it's easy to compare across cultures and back in time, because if you and I start dating, we don't have to like register ourselves on some sort of formal dating database. And also, even if we did, we wouldn't be able to look back over time and compare our dating to dating in the 70s, for example. So I understand why it's done, but it's really important to recognize the ambiguity and the nuance. Hopefully you talked about this in your breakout groups. Is monogamy natural? In humans, it doesn't look like it. So the OECD looked at 160 countries, which is almost all the countries in the world, and found that 46% permitted monogamy partially or fully. That's almost half, where marriage to more than one person is acceptable. And so of the remaining countries, you have 21% in a US study of more than 6,000 people, 21% had tried consensual non-monogamy, so where they both agreed they were going to try being with other people. So that might be swinging, or it might be an open relationship, or it might be polyamory. And then of the people who are theoretically in monogamous relationships, the infidelity stats are really high. So you have up to 72% of men and 70% of women, depending on the study, and it's not always that high, please don't panic, but it can be very high. Then, where exactly is monogamy happening? So I don't think monogamy is universal. It doesn't mean that it's not natural, but there are plenty of things that are natural that we wouldn't necessarily say are good. So I think it's a bit complicated, but on balance, I don't think it is in humans. And in animals, no. So like the vast majority of the animal kingdom are non-monogamous. Those that we thought were, like swans, DNA testing proves that they're not. And in any clutch of eggs, 40% are fathered by a different male, I think that's right. And then also our closest living relative, most believe is the bonobo, and they have sex all the time. They have sex to say hello, they have sex to say thank you, they have sex to say, instead of a cuddle, let's just have sex. They have it all the time, and so I don't really understand where the evidence is to say that monogamy is natural. But it's socially expected in a lot of cultures. And the reason I think the monogamy is natural question is relevant is because it may be that monogamy is difficult. And yet when people fail to be monogamous, it is, one of the most shameful experiences. It's the leading cause of breakups and divorce, but yet it happens all the time. So, no. Why do people cheat? Again, maybe you discussed this. I'd love to know what reasons you came up with. There's been some research where people have gone up to people and gone, researchers have gone up to people and gone, so you cheated, why did you do that? And when we're getting the responses back on this, we are relying on what people say, and I think people don't always know why they cheat, but the responses are interesting. People have said fun, career advancement, escapism, a need for conquest and power, exploring sexual identity, a desire for variety, and to combat feeling inadequate. But there are plenty of reasons that you might cheat for reasons you're unaware of. Like if you've always been a kind of false self, where you've been the person that achieves endlessly and lives within the rules and does what was expected of you without really connecting with what you need, at some point you might have enough of that. And the way you might choose to tear it all down is risk the thing that you care most about. What's the next slide? Right, no. So which relates to a point that I think is really important, that is, I came across this belief that infidelity only happens in unhappy relationships, and the research just doesn't back that up. Shirley Glass, who was an amazing infidelity researcher, found that in one study it was 56% of men and 34% of women, or the other way around for the genders, cheated, but said they were either happy or very happy in their current relationships. So I don't think it's reasonable to think that it has to do with happiness levels in a relationship. It might have to do with that individual. Also, let's not forget what we're dealing with here. We have whatever it is that motivated rats to kill themselves, i.e. stimulation of the brain's reward system, and this kind of the potency of drugs. So like with Claire, what would it have been like if she dated the same people? Claire dated married men in her 20s and 30s, exclusively married men. What would that have been like if they dated when they were both fully available? Like if they'd met in a post office queue on a rainy day. And also there is evidence to suggest that when you meet someone in like a dangerous circumstance, which cheating by definition is, they're more alluring because you engage the fight and flight response and then attribute it to your partner. So there are more questions like, how do you know when it's time to walk away? Should you stay together for the children? Is there a better time to remarry after loss? But I'm not going to go into it because I've been talking for too long, and they're in the book. So the last section, do you remember at the beginning I was like, I will tell you at the end if you've fallen asleep. So please wake up if you've fallen asleep. The way you think, feel, and behave about relationships might say more about you than your partner. Or it might say more about the way you and your partner interact. But what it does not say is just everything about your partner, because that's not how relationships work. Love is built and not found, and the building process can tap into stuff that is very difficult for us. And a lot of what we think about love is wrong. And it's everywhere you look. We're just fed these really unhelpful ideas, and we feed them to children as well. You should definitely buy my book if you don't have one already. For yourself, your partner, lover, or next Tinder date. And then this is what Richard Curtis said about the book, which was amazing. He said it was a really interesting, proper analysis of the ins and outs of love. Much better and more useful than my film.